So for more than 2 decades, SABC News has had a permanent presence in the United States. Initially, we had 3 bureaus in Washington, New York, and the United Nations, and later downscaling to a single office that to this day still operates out of the UN headquarters in Manhattan. That office has been a mainstay of our international coverage, from the work of the UN Security Council, the Secretariat, and the various agencies that do life-saving work right across the world, to the multilateral positions of Pretoria, while keeping a close eye on major developments in the US, its elections, its geopolitical relations, and the controversies that have emerged from one presidency to the next. And through it all, our eyes and ears on the ground for much of the last 2 decades has been correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease and videographer Aaron Berger, who continue to hold the fort for us as we mark 75 years of news here at the public broadcaster. Let's bring in Sherwin then, live from New York as always. Sherwin, good to see you on anniversary day. You know, I remember you with Cindy Mabi on Weekend Live, but in 2008, you were then appointed to the office where you are now, ahead of one of the most important, in fact, presidential elections in the US in its history, which then became the focus, naturally, of your deployment at the time. Let's talk about how it all came about for you and Aaron.
What a great memory, Tembekile, taking me from the very comfortable confines of Weekend Live alongside Cindy Mabi to hitting the road running when I moved to the United States in August of 2008. And of course, as you correctly point out, that first story, the big story of the day, of that week, of that month, in fact, of the rest of that year, was the election of Barack Obama, the first, who would later become the first black president of the United States. What I recall Desmond Tutu, the emeritus Archbishop of Cape Town, speaking a day before his inauguration at the Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., saying in that high-pitched voice which you'd recognize, "This is your Mandela moment," he told the audience in that sermon, and it just resonated with me. And so within 2 weeks of arriving in the United States, I was still staying in a hotel. I hadn't even found my accommodation. I was on the road covering the election of Barack Obama, his convention in Denver, Colorado. 2 weeks later was the convention of John McCain. They suspended that convention because at the time they didn't want the images of Republicans celebrating their nominee while there was a huge hurricane called Hurricane Gustav, the biggest hurricane since Katrina that happened in 2005. Was approaching the southern United States. So they suspended the Republican convention for John McCain in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I then jumped in a car, drove to the airport using MapQuest back in those days. Forget about GPS. You had to print out your directions on a piece of paper, put it in the car, drove to the airport. Aaron flew in from Atlanta, from Washington, D.C. We met in Atlanta, drove into the hurricane, into New Orleans, covered the hurricane, flew back to Minneapolis, St. Paul, was there for the nomination, the official nomination of John McCain. And of course, the rest is history. Obama, of course, going on to a historic victory. I was at the inauguration in Washington, D.C. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, on the Great Mall outside the United States Capitol, and just a hugely historic moment, and such a privilege that was my first story that I was able to be part of here in the United States.
And in that almost 20 years, Sherwin, you've been able to squeeze in 2 Trump presidencies, Joe Biden somewhere in there, some hugely significant hearings at the UN Security Council. What else stands out for you?
Yeah, I've covered all the presidents, right? So a big focus of our work is not only covering the work of the United Nations, but also domestic politics in the United States. We've covered elections, right? And so we talk about the historic moment that Obama was elected and inaugurated, when he walked out with his kids and Michelle Obama in Chicago on that autumn night in November, saying, "Hello, Chicago." But then, of course, if you were a Democratic supporter of Hillary Clinton, the huge disappointment that came after her defeat to the very unexpected surge of, former businessman Donald Trump. And of course, then you had the COVID-19 pandemic, which sort of overshadowed the end of that presidency. You then have the reemergence of the former vice president under Obama in the likes of Joe Biden, winning, by about 3 million votes in a very tightly contested race against the current incumbent in the White House during a COVID-19 pandemic, which was, of course, a huge story in the United States in and of itself, Tembekile. You'll recall that at one point, even before COVID had really hit South Africa, the epicenter of the pandemic was in the United States. We were covering stories from our homes. We were growing in our affinity for things like Teams and Zoom in terms of our coverage. You needed an internet connection so that you could report the news in those days. And so, covering stories here at the United Nations, be that the political dynamics in the United States, but also the geopolitical concerns, right? You think about the war in Ukraine, you think about the war in Gaza, you also think about the development agenda, things like the Paris Climate Change Agreement that was essentially negotiated among the member states of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. We often talk about the 2030 trajectory adopted here in the General Assembly in 2015, and that really is the blueprint for how we as a society, as a human race, survive, what we know is coming, overcome things like poverty, food insecurity, gender empowerment, strong institutions and good governance, water and sanitation, the bedrock essentially of how humanity is going to survive. So it's been very interesting to have a front row seat to some of the big stories of the day.
And just to cast our eyes beyond the United States and the work you've done there, Sherwin, you have been fortunate enough to travel, in fact, with the SABC News team, even in the region, right? And I'm curious about whether there are countries that you recall that stand out today, perhaps even stories from people that you were able to interact with during those assignments.
I've been to Canada. I covered former Deputy President Kgalema Motlante's working visit to Canada a number of years ago. We also covered President Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to not this G7, but a G7 a few years ago, where we did a live interview with the president from Canada. And I remember right after that interview, President Ramaphosa, we sort of linked back to studio. It was a live discussion. The president slunk back in his chair and said to me, he did this with his hands, Tembekile, and said, "Wow, you're really tough, Sherwin." But that was just President Ramaphosa's personality. I don't think he was offended by it, but perhaps in his view, I maybe put him through the ringer, which I think is part of the job. So no apologies there. I'm also recalling in this moment, Tembekile, a day former President Zuma arrived in New York for the UN General Assembly. I covered him for the entirety of his presidency when he used to come annually to that GA here in New York. And I remember, we used to line up outside the hotel. All these ministers would wait, sort of the entourage would be there to welcome the president. And he spotted me in the crowd. I was sort of waiting there for a doorstep. And he looks over at me and he goes, "When I see you, I see questions." So that was one story about President Zuma. I've covered President Zuma and Deputy President Ramaphosa on state visits, working visits, 3 times to Cuba. I've covered UN conferences in Brazil. I covered a BRICS summit under the former BRICS Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. President Zuma was there. We've covered UN conferences, a youth conference in Guanajuato, Mexico. So we've been very blessed and privileged. Jamaica, a state visit by President Zuma, to travel the region where there was a clear South African African interest. And so, I've been racking up those miles. But, with budget cuts and all of that, we haven't been able to travel too much.
Are you campaigning, Sherwin? Such a hard knock life you've had.
Slipping that in there, Tembi, slipping that in.
Such a hard knock life you've had. We're looking at pictures of you riding around in a vintage convertible. Presidents recognize you on site. And one of the people who've been central to all of those deployments, in fact, is our international news editor, Sophie, who is outgoing, in fact, at the moment. What do you recall from your time together with her?
Sophie and I have worked very closely now for more than a decade. We don't refer to her as the international news editor in my home or in my conversations. She's known as Mama Sophie. She's known as our mother. In fact, when I talk to Ditabo or to Kaya or to any of my colleagues on the international news desk, we say, "Where's Mother? Did she go straight from the airport straight to the office again? She didn't sleep last night, did she?" Sophie, when there's breaking news late at night, and it's sort of 4 p.m. here in New York or 6 p.m., you'll see Sophie posting on social media, it's going to be a long night, which I've always taken to mean, Sherwin, I'm relying on you because I need to go to bed at some point. Listen, this is a workhorse. This is like removing with her retirement, like removing a brick from a foundation in the structure that is the SABC. She has been a constant force, a very hard-working individual that has really led from the front. And I think there will certainly be a huge, huge void to be filled once Sophie finally exits the building and doesn't come back. We know that we're going to have a little bit longer, perhaps until the end of the G20. But let me just be one of the several to pour accolades on her shoulders and tell her she's going to be a hard act to follow, but we'll certainly dig deep in trying. She will very much be missed, and I think it goes without saying that she's been an icon of the SABC for more than 3 decades, and we certainly appreciate her service and her lessons that she's taught us. She's not only been an editor, but she's been a mother to me, and I will really, really miss her once she leaves the SABC.
I'm listening to you, Sherwin, and I can recall hearing her many years ago, before she was on camera, on Lesedi FM, where she pronounced...
I have a beeping in my ear, so I can't hear you.
Oh, he's got a beeping in his ear, so let's let him go. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, perfectly timed. Man in Washington here on the SABC, ending there with reflections. Sherwin, I'm told we have you back, so I was going to circle back to the point you're making about Sophie Mugwena, your mama at the international desk. Are you able to hear me now? Oh, well, that's gone. I mean, looks like even the comms are retiring. What can you do? That was Sherwin Bryce-Pease reflecting on 75 years of SABC News. And we'll continue to bring you more of those reflections throughout the evening here on SABC News.